Hi there, I'm Josh, and today we're talking about the i7-920 in 2023. The i7-920 has 4 cores and 8 threads, a TDP of 130 watts, a base clock of 2.66 GHz, and a boost clock of 2.93 GHz. And is on the LGA 1366 platform, which means you're running with 16 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. Now, we are also going to be running this with an RTX 2060, which is a completely unreasonable configuration, but I wanted to push this CPU as much as possible. So let's hop into the benchmarks and see how this performs in 2023. Up first is Lethal Company at 1080p with an average frame rate of 78 FPS, a 1% low of 2, and a 0.1% low of 1. So the CPU is definitely holding back the GPU here, but the game struggled in the 1% and 0.1% lows quite a lot. So even though you're able to get a good average frame rate, this game is very hard to play because of the low 1% and 0.1% lows. Baldur's Gate 3 up next at 1080p with a mixture of high and ultra settings, ran with an average frame rate of 62, a 1% low of 22, and a 0.1% low of 3. Now there are a few ways to mitigate the effects of the CPU on the GPU, and one of those ways is by setting the settings to higher. Sometimes we'll see either no performance impact or very little performance impact. Or you could increase the resolution, which I considered doing, but if you're buying an i7-920, chances are you're going to be running this at 1080p, and I would recommend getting a better CPU for higher resolution gaming anyway. But Baldur's Gate 3 I would consider to be playable, because although there was some jitter here and there, it wasn't nearly as bad as Lethal Company was. And I was frankly quite surprised by this result. Up next, Cyberpunk 2077, once again with the high settings at 1080p, ran with an average frame rate of 42, a 1% low of 12, and a 0.1% low of 5. So the 1%, 0.1% lows indicate some jitter here and there. It definitely was better than Lethal Company again, but it wasn't very good at all. So I would recommend sticking to older games with this CPU. Obviously, Cyberpunk 2077 is a very demanding game. Speaking of, Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p with the low settings ran with an average frame rate of 48 frames per second. And this was after testing with the highest settings, medium settings, whatever. The best average frame rate came from the low settings at 48 FPS, which is not playable for CS2, and there was a lot of jitter throughout. Lost Ark at 1080p with the high settings ran with an average frame rate of 87, a 1% low of 2, and a 0.1% low of 1. So again, not a very good experience to be playing this game, especially if you get into combat-specific scenarios. This CPU is going to struggle quite a lot. And last but not least, Lies of P at 1080p with the high settings ran with an average frame rate of 86, a 1% low of 44, and a 0.1% low of 2, which again I think is a representative of how good this game is optimized, because even on this 15-year-old CPU, you're seeing 86 FPS with decent 1% and 0.1% lows. Now, obviously, the 0.1% low is very low, but that didn't happen very often if you look at the 1% low frame rate. So should you buy an i7-920 in 2023? I don't think so. I think this has run its course. I think if you upgrade to I would recommend an i7-4790 at the minimum budget end of things with a GTX 1060. Anything below that is going to struggle in modern games. But this was a very interesting experience, and it actually put up more of a fight than I thought it would. So I would still say for fun, if you wanted to get this, these are pretty cheap now. And if you wanted to test older games with it, you're going to have no issues whatsoever, but it's still not a CPU I'd recommend to anybody in 2023. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, like, subscribe, do what you usually do, and as always, buy yourself something nice.